Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Aslı and I'm a Regional Examination Director for British Council Wider Europe region. We are very happy welcoming you all today as the representatives of organizations that are accepting IELTS course or planning to engage with us. So before we start, let me share a couple of things with you. This session will be recorded and the recording will be shared with all of you via email after the session, together with an online survey. So please make sure you fill it out, since your feedback and suggestions are very important and will help make future sessions even better. So this session will last for 90 minutes, 60 minutes for the presentations and the last 30 minutes for the questions. During the webinar, you can send your questions or comments through the Q&A, and we will do our best to answer all of them. Okay, today we are here as a large community of IELTS on this call. We have representation from important institutions, universities and organizations for more than 15 countries in Europe and Asia, all accepting IELTS course or planning to accept for their admission processes. So our topic is IELTS and the reasons why high-stakes testing is crucial for the future of your organization. Today, I'm with Stephen Carey, our Head of Global Relationship Management for IELTS, and Professor Barry O'Sullivan, the Head of Assessment, Research and Development, and Ashley Bodale, our IELTS Global Account Manager for Higher Education. Okay, welcome again, everyone. And now I would like to give the word to Stephen. Over to you, Stephen.
Hello again, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here today, and thank you so much for giving us your time. As Asla says, we will cover as much as possible about IELTS today, but especially we're going to be looking at what IELTS is and why IELTS is the best solution for you. As in language testing, the conversation should not be only about one aspect of a test, but in fact about many different aspects, including, but not limited to, test validity, test reliability, and test security. So moving on, we'll start with the basics. So what is IELTS? IELTS is the International English Language Testing System. Let me tell you about the joint owners of IELTS. So we have three joint owners: British Council, IDP IELTS Australia, and Cambridge Assessment English. Cambridge Assessment English design and set the test. They are experts in English language assessment. They celebrated 100 years in this field back in 2013. British Council and IDP have a global footprint and are experts in delivering exams securely around the world. British Council is also the UK's organisation for cultural relations. And so through our work, we are aiming to deliver cultural impact around the world. And IDP, apart from their education experience, are also the world's largest student placement organisation. Between the three partners together, we have over 200 years of experience in English language assessment. Moving on, what does IELTS actually do? As it says on the slide, IELTS assesses the English language ability of people who intend to study or work where English is the medium of communication. So we know that traditionally that meant people who were going to study or work in English majority speaking countries. But of course, as the world has changed, so have we. And now we are seeing that many people are using IELTS to prove their English ability for use in non-majority English-speaking countries, wherever people need to work or study or get a job where English is required. To that end, IELTS is now recognized by well over 10,000 organizations worldwide. And I think that's a key part, that it's recognized by lots of different types of organizations. It's the only test that's recognized by all immigration agencies that require one. It's recognized also by professional associations, so medicine, the law, the arts, who require people with a high level of English proficiency, doctors, nurses. It's also used by employers when they are doing recruitment and selection. And lastly, and of course the biggest segment, by higher education institutions around the world. And one key thing here, which we'll come back to during the presentation, is that IELTS uses real life tasks to reflect real life language. Another reason we believe IELTS stands above the rest is due to the content of the test, and especially that it is a test of international English. What does that mean? It means, to an extent, in the tasks and task types that we use, cultural or linguistic bias is minimized, i.e., so we are not using particular expressions such as that may be familiar to one culture or one part of the world, but not to another, such as talking about English gardens, or such as talking about Christmas. That type of content would not be used so as to minimize cultural or linguistic bias. The real life texts and tasks used on the test are sourced from all over the English-speaking world, and they take generally around 3 years through a whole rigorous production process. It takes about 3 years to bring the texts and tasks to life in the form of a real IELTS question. In the listening test, we use a variety of accents. Speakers from all around the world with accents, American, Australian, Canadian, New Zealand accents. And of course, on the test, in the writing and speaking test, all standard varieties of English are accepted. It doesn't matter if the person uses British spelling or American spelling, for example. So we do believe that this is very important. And then we do listen to our customers, the organizations who accept the IELTS scores. And the one thing that you tell us consistently again and again over time is that you want us to continue increasing access to the test. So, to this end, this is what we've been doing. In 2018, we've introduced IELTS on computer. This is exactly the same IELTS, the same paper-based test, but stuck on a computer. So IELTS on computer or paper-based IELTS is exactly the same, but of course it provides the customer more choice. So we've expanded this offer of computer-delivered IELTS, which since July 2018 to now over 60 countries, and that includes over 37 locations in your region, in wider Europe. And there are benefits both for you and for the test takers as well. So for yourselves, benefits include that if you point us to significant demand in a particular area, we are able to open new computer-delivered IELTS centres more quickly, and so we can respond to demand. Also, computer-delivered IELTS can be delivered 7 days a week, up to 3 times a day, if we need to do so. And on the theme of continuing innovative improvement to our service delivery, the results for computer-delivered IELTS are available gradually within less and less time, at the moment between 2 to 5 days, and all can be verified online, which I will say more about later. And of course, at the same time, paper-based IELTS continues all around the world according to demand. Another innovation that we've brought to life is the video call speaking test. So the IELTS speaking test, again, it's exactly the same, a one-on-one, two-way interaction between the customer and the examiner, but a select group of IELTS test centres are now delivering the IELTS speaking test like this, via high-definition video calls, with the interaction between the test taker, who must be in a test centre, going through all of the same security protocols, and the examiner, who can be in a different place, possibly another test centre or another location, either in the same country or indeed in a different country. Exactly the same test, but they can be in different locations. Obviously, this increases the accessibility, increases the number of speaking tests that we can deliver at any one time. Test takers get exactly the same high quality of identity verification, and it's the same real-life two-way interaction. We've done extensive research into that. We've been piloting this new service since 2018. The rollout program started in 2019, and the research and the comparative analysis that we've been doing during all of that time shows that there's no statistical difference, or no significant statistical difference between people doing the speaking test face-to-face or doing the speaking test over the internet. Okay, I'll now pass to my colleague Ash, who is an expert in IELTS score format and scores, and she's going to take you through the next few slides. Over to you, Ashley.
Thank you, Stephen. Good morning, everybody. Just to echo Stephen's words, thank you for joining us today. We're incredibly excited to be talking to you today and hearing your views. My name's Ashley Bodell. I'm the Global Account Manager for Higher Education in IELTS, and I would like to take you through 2 areas. One is the format of the IELTS test, and secondly, the scoring system for the IELTS test. So for the format of the IELTS test, a lot of you will be already familiar that we have 2 versions of IELTS. The first version is academic IELTS. This is usually required by educational institutions or professional bodies assessing applications for registrations to health and legal professions, for example. So the academic version would be most relevant to you today as an educational institution. Academic IELTS is designed to assess abilities of test takers to be able to study at undergraduate or postgraduate in the medium of English. Generally, 75% of IELTS worldwide, the IELTS test, are academic. However, this does vary considerably from country to country. The second version of IELTS is general IELTS. General IELTS is used mainly for test takers who are going to English-speaking countries for work experience or training programs, which are not at a degree level. And one of the most popular reasons would be for immigration purposes. So that covers academic IELTS and general training IELTS. I'm now going to move on to the format of the test. And so there's a little diagram here. Hopefully that's very clear, and I'm going to talk you through it. As you can see, there are the two versions of the IELTS tests are conducted in exactly the same format. The first three steps of the IELTS academic test and the IELTS general training are the same in format. So although the questions will be different, the format of the test is the same, meaning that the listening, the reading, and the writing are all for the duration of 2.5 hours, so 2.5 hours. These three components of the test, they run consecutively. So that means one component after another. So in a sequence, but in the same sitting for 2.5 hours. The listening and reading, they are answered on pre-printed paper and they will be assessed by a clerical marker, whereas the writing and speaking components are marked by highly trained examiners. And as you'll already be aware, the speaking test is conducted face to face with an examiner. So that's the format. The speaking will be taken either can be taken prior to the listening, reading and writing, or on the same day or later, but within a 7-day window. So just to let you know that most countries will operate based on the need there. We move on to IELTS. So this is a public version of the band scores with some indication of the criteria at each level. So you can see that band score, IELTS 9 band scale, it runs from 0 to 9. You'll notice that 0 means that the test taker perhaps did not turn up, so there was no accessible information. Right up to a band 9, which is an expert user. So I think the ones that would be most relevant for us to focus on today would be band scores between 5 and 7. Scores ranging between 5 and 7 would be what are most commonly required for entry-level admissions onto undergraduate or in some cases postgraduate courses by higher education institutions. If we have a look at a band 5, band 5 is considered a modest user where they have a partial command of the language. A band 6 is a competent user. They have generally an effective command of the language, moving up to a band score 7, where we would consider that person to be a good user with an operational command of language. So there is a progression of the command of the language. It would be very unusual to see a requirement set at an 8 or even perhaps a 9, other than for someone who is embarking on a course of speech therapy or journalism is where you may see requirements for an 8, but the most common requested would be a 5 to a 7. And just to move on a little bit regarding the format of the test, IELTS are very proud to be able to offer additional requirements. In conjunction with our partners at Cambridge, we can provide special modification samples of the test. So that it may be someone has a visual impairment where they require larger test papers. It may be a test taker would require a Braille version, or perhaps a special listening test if there is an audio impairment. We can also provide lip reading versions of listening tests. So there are many requirements that we can provide given a notice period of 3 months. That is something that is available. And additionally to that, with a shorter notice period of 6 weeks, we can also ensure that any administrative arrangements can be provided. That could be extra time, it could be special equipment, or perhaps word processing software. So there are an array of measures we have in place for those test takers which might require special attention or modification. So that's just a brief overview of the formats and the scores, and I'm going to hand back to Stephen.
Thanks, Ash. That's great. I'm just going to continue now with what I know is an important topic for everyone, and that is results verification. So I imagine the majority of you will receive the paper test report forms from your applicants, which is great. However, it's really important. We want you to be confident that the results you're accepting are genuine, so that we can protect the interests of genuine customers and genuine students. So we have a key role in supporting you in that. We provide the free IELTS results verification service, which I'm going to demonstrate now. Then, we want you to verify every test report form online, preferably, so that you can view those results as they really are recorded in our global master database, and that way you can rest assured that your organization cannot be cheated by fraudsters or people who try to run scams in all types of tests. So the verification service, so what you will receive in the post, in the mail, is normally the hard copy paper test report form that you see there. All IELTS customers are issued with one test report form once they've got their results, and many of them like to keep that and frame it, use it as a certificate, and then they can request additional copies of test report forms to send to the institutions of their choice. At that point, we really want you to use the results verification service. You can access this easily through ielts.org/organizations, and the registration page, you can see halfway down that on the left-hand bar, you can see the place where you need to register, and you do need to fill out a form and send it off. You can do that online. Once you have got access to the verification service, it's free, by the way, once you've got the access, you'll have a login email address and password, as it shows there on the left. You enter those, and then once you're into the system, you will see a screen like this. Down the left navigation there, the second one, you see TRF query. That's the test report form query. You click on that, and then the next step, once you're in TRF query, at the bottom there you can see a box where you must enter the test report form number. Enter the test report form number there and click verify, and bingo! You should then see on the left, you see how it looks in our system, and on the right is an image of the test report form. You should be able to compare the two and see exactly the same test taker with exactly the same scores, exactly the same test date of birth, test date, etc., etc. However, occasionally you may look at the two and realize that there is a mismatch. That's why it is important to look carefully. It doesn't take long, but maybe a minute for each test report form. And if we look carefully here at the difference between the two, you can see that the photo is slightly different, but most importantly, somebody has tampered with the paper test report form on the right, and it is showing a score, an overall band score of 6.5. But you see on the left in the system, or in red, you see the overall band score of 5.5. So somebody here has tampered with that form. It may, of course, not be the customer, the test taker themselves. It could have been an unscrupulous agent or some middle person along the way. But the point is that you should not then accept that score. Another thing that can happen, of course, is that a mismatch can be found where the photo of the test taker in our system is really quite different from the photo on the paper test report form. So it is important to be alert to that as well. And the last thing that can happen is that the screen comes up with, just like that, no match found. When no match is found, this doesn't automatically mean that there is a problem. It can be that the result perhaps has the customer has collected their paper test report form very quickly, and for some reason the score hasn't yet got into the right place in the system. It could be that there's just a technical glitch. It's very unusual, but it could be that there's a technical glitch. Or it could be, of course, that somebody has created a false test report form. If that's the case, it's really important that you write to us at this email address, ielts.verification@britishcouncil.org, and then we can investigate for you. If the test was taken at an IDP test centre, the same applies. There is an email address you can write to, or you can simply write to this one, and we will check if the test was taken at IDP, and if so, liaise with IDP so that we can answer your query for you. So in summary, we take our responsibility very seriously. We want you to rest assured that your organisation is safe as long as you verify every test report form you receive, and contact us in case of any questions. We have strong controls in place to ensure high levels of security, and we do believe that's a very important part, one very important part of an English language test. Barry is going to tell us a little bit more about the other important parts in a moment, but just to conclude this part of the webinar, IELTS is a high stakes test of communicative proficiency in English. It continues to use the real life two-way face-to-face speaking test. It covers the entire range of proficiency in all 4 skills. It's a quality, valid and reliable assessment trusted by over 10,000 organisations worldwide, and it offers you a free verification service that you should use. And and those scores have a recommended validity period of 2 years. I'm just going to pause there because I think Barry is going to take control of the screen. And while he does, I'll just tell you about a couple of modifications that we've made to IELTS over the last few months to support you and our customers during the COVID-19 pandemic. So just a couple of things there. Obviously, in all of the test centres where we're currently running IELTS, a lot of health and safety precautions have been put in place. And in terms of the organisations using the scores, we are comfortable if at this moment, due to delays in people being able to get their tests out, being able to get their test report forms or being able to get them posted out to you, we are comfortable if you decide to use an IELTS test report form that's older than 2 years up to 3 years old. I think that's it, and I think Barry's ready. So Barry, I'll pass over to you.
Well, I was ready a moment ago, but I'm not ready now. Usually technology bites me, and it's bitten again. But we're here, I think.
There it is.
Yes, we're here. Right. I pray that nothing happened. Okay. I'd like to thank the guys for inviting me to talk about IELTS today. I'm not just going to talk about IELTS though, because I think a lot of what you've heard already really gives you the answer as to why you need to use IELTS. I'm going to give a little bit of a semi-technical, then moving on to a technical description of the reasons why I believe that IELTS is the best solution. And in fact, everything you've heard in the last presentation could slip into this presentation quite easily. First of all, what is a test? Well, I always like to think of a test as a whole series of snapshots. And as you can see here, we have a range of cameras. And the really important thing about the test then is what exactly are you taking a picture of? And how accurate can that picture be? Number one, the first thing we have to do when we think about a test is we have to define the construct. If we're thinking about nuts, for example, what nuts are we looking at? What exactly do we want to take a snapshot of? Once we've made that decision and we define really clearly what we want to take a picture of, then we're ready to go. But of course, things can go wrong. You can have masses and masses of information, so lots and lots of questions, lots and lots of tasks in your test. But if you're looking at the wrong nuts, the picture is useless. It's meaningless and it tells you nothing that's sensible. We're going to come back to this point because I think it's really important later on. The other very important thing that Stephen alluded to when he was talking was the fact that when you take the picture, when you define your construct, you define it not in terms of knowledge, but in terms of the reality of how it's used. That's massively important for language. If we don't think about language as something real and something that we can use, well, then it's not going to help us to do anything. Because we have lots of tests that are out there that tests our knowledge of vocabulary or grammar or something very simple. But how well does that tell us how a person can use the language in the real world? That's a critical part of the discussions. And of course, the other problem we have is we have too little data. We either have all the same camera taking all the same picture, or we have too few. So the picture that we're getting just isn't sharp enough, and it doesn't tell us enough about the person's language. Okay, that's the sort of conceptual side of things. Let's think about the technical side. I'll go fairly technical for a little while now. For a start, when we think about what a test should look like, we have to think about it from different perspectives. The first perspective is the test taker. And when we think about the test taker, we think about their individual characteristics such as physical, like age, gender, etc. Their psychological, motivation, memory, and all of these things. And their experiential, what experiences do they have of the language, of the test, of education in general. But we also need to think about the language, knowledge, and use that they've got in their head, because that's what we're trying to get at. So we need to be very clear about what we're trying to get at in that person. Next, we think of the test system, which looks at the test taker, particularly the language, knowledge, and use bit, and tries to turn that into an operational test. So then we have to think about what input do we give them? So what kind of language do we use? What kind of texts do we use? What kind of questions do we use? Then what kind of output are we expecting of the person? And then we think about delivery. And we just heard Stephen talking about security. And security is a massively important part of this whole equation, because everything else can be perfect. But if the security isn't appropriate, then the test is really useless. It's not telling you anything that you can trust. The final part of the jigsaw really is a scoring system. And we've heard a little bit from Ash about the raters, about the training. But we'll also think a little bit more about the consistency of the scoring, the accuracy of the scoring, and the value of the actual score in the end. So when we're conceptualizing a test, when we're developing a test, or when we're validating a test, these are the minimum things that we think about. And in an ideal world, in a perfect world, when you're evaluating a test, these are the minimum things you think about. Obviously, that's a simplified model. The actual full model is this. It's called a socio-cognitive model. It was developed by myself and Cyril Weir almost 20 years ago, and he wrote a really great book about it in 2005, and I have worked on the model ever since. A book coming out in October of this year from Micheline Chaloup-Deville and myself also has a large section which is devoted to them explaining what the model is and how it works in detail. And as in October, it's a perfect Christmas present, so I expect that you'll all be buying them for yourselves and your family. How does IELTS deal with the issues that we've been talking about then? Well, let's think about the test taker. Well, these are just the headline areas. Obviously, the test deals with every aspect. I've just given you a few just to give you a thought about, we think about the age of the candidates, because we always say that it's for young adults and adults. IELTS isn't really appropriate for younger learners, mainly because they're just not able to cope with the cognitive demand of some of the tasks, particularly at the higher levels. We also try to make sure that the test is gender neutral, that it's not biased towards or against male or female candidates. And that's done by ensuring that the specifications for the test and the item writer guidelines for the test are very clear in ensuring that they write items that are appropriate. But also in post-test analysis, we do what we call DIF analysis, differential item functioning, which tells us if there are groups within the population that are biased either towards or against. And that's something that's done on a regular basis. We also look at disabilities, as we heard from Ash a little bit earlier. There's a lot of work done on that. We'll have a little think about that in a minute. We also have the psychological. We think about motivation in terms of the content, in terms of the way the content is delivered. It's delivered in a particular structure, in a particular order, to keep motivation high, to keep concentration high, and to avoid the concept of memory. It's not a memory test, it's a language test. Many tests that are out there fail to get the fact that the main focus of the test is language. Some concentrate on your typing ability, some concentrate on your memory. So we try to keep that out of the equation. In terms of experience then, we try to make sure that IELTS test takers have as much knowledge of the test available to them for free as they possibly can get. Many other tests force you to pay for this knowledge, which I always object to. We also make sure that they know what kind of responses are required to attain particular scores, and that information is always made available to them. We also expect that they have a particular level of education in their own language, because we're hoping that they have reached a certain level of schooling and that they're now ready to move on. But there is a certain assumption that they have a particular education level. A very important part of the whole process, though, of identifying, of thinking about the test taker is understanding the cognitive language model. So behind each paper, there are models. And I'm going to show you one in a minute. I'm not going to talk about it for very long because it's far too complicated. But just to give you an idea of what we're talking about. But behind every paper, there's a clearly defined model of language ability and progression. There's also interactive social models, particularly the ones done in red here are where these ones are most likely to be found. So, for example, in writing, you're always told who you're writing to, who the reader is going to be. In speaking, you've got a real person there in front of you, so there is no danger that you will conceive of a different listener. The test taker model, and I'm just giving you an example that Ash gave earlier. This is the actual web page where you look for special requirements. And as she said earlier as well, IELTS is very proud to say that it's the test that probably makes the most effort of any test around to ensure that all test takers are playing on a level playing field, so that you can make sure that test takers who need special requirements get them as appropriate. This is one of those language models that I talk about. It comes from Khalifa and Weir from 2009, a very good book on the construct of reading in the Cambridge University Press Studies and Language Testing series. And as you can see in this, it's quite a complicated model, but the bottom line is it's quite simple. So it starts with visual input, so word recognition. So it starts at the very basic format of language. And as you get more and more accomplished at reading, you begin to do more and more interesting things until you get to the very end, where you're looking at intertextuality, as we call it, where you're looking at a number of different texts to get a piece of information. And what we try to do in IELTS is to ensure that we're moving away from the bottom end, because we're not terribly interested in that. So we're moving up more towards the middle to the higher ends to ensure that the kind of language that's been tested in the reading paper, because this is all about just reading, is appropriate. And it's telling us information about the individual that's actually meaningful. And again, a lot of other tests that are out there are not telling us things that are really fantastically meaningful, at least in my opinion. In terms of the test system, we think about the input parameters. So, things like the timing, the planning time, the language that's used in the input. It can't be a very high level language if we're trying to distinguish between, let's say, a 4 and a 7 or a 4 and an 8. A person who's at the lower end won't understand the language of the question, so they're disenfranchised essentially. So what we have to do is ensure that the language of the input is tightly controlled and is appropriate. We also control the social variables, as I said earlier, and that's mostly related to the productive skills. We have output parameters, so we need to know exactly what we expect of the person, what knowledge of the language, what social linguistic use of the language. Is it appropriate? Is there pragmatic control appropriate? So we need to know as much as possible and have taken into account as much as possible what the output, expected output from the test is. So when we're designing the test, we design the test with a particular kind of input, with an expected output, and then we test, did the input generate the output? It's a big part of the test, and it's a big part of the validation process. And of course, it comes back down to the bottom line in many cases is the practicality, which is the delivery parameters. We have to have security pre, during, and post the test. If we don't, the test is essentially useless to us. And as Stephen was pointing out, IELTS prides itself on getting that part of it right. And, you know, the British Council and IDP are experts and have been experts for many years in delivering tests. The British Council, for example, delivers millions of tests, not just for the British Council and IELTS, but for other institutions around the world. We also have to ensure, of course, that the delivery is uniform. It's got to be the same. So if you're doing the test in Germany or in Spain or in China, that the format, the structure of how you experience that test day should always be the same. Otherwise, it makes comparing results quite complicated. One of the ways that we ensure that the validity of the test is by having a massive variety of task types. And if you remember back to the early slides with the multiple photos, the more different types of information you have, the richer the information you get about the person. If all the questions are the same, then you've got a problem. Of course, we also heard about the quality assurance process, and something that can take up to 3 years, which sounds mad, but it is the reality. From the day that the commissioning editors commission their item writers to start work, it goes through all of these processes. The pre-editing, the editing, the libs is the item bank, it goes into the bank, then it's pre-tested and it's reviewed, and if it's not good enough, it goes back into editing, or actually it might get binned altogether. If it's good enough, it goes into standard fixing and then into paper construction. So it's a long drawn out process, which is monitored at every stage and every level. In terms of the scoring system, we have, well, you could talk about this all day long, because in many ways, the whole process of getting from a performance to a meaningful score is the core of the test, you can say. So in terms of raters and examiners, we look at their qualifications. They must go through a training process. There are selection parameters, so they do an examination essentially after their training. They go through strict standardization processes, and that has to happen regularly. And they're monitored, their work is monitored regularly to ensure that they're on target all the time. In terms of consistency, are they consistent both internally, which is intra-rater, or between raters? How reliable, how consistently reliable are the scores that are being given? The raters being for the writing and the speaking, and the item task consistency then is for the reading and listening. We also have to think about accuracy, because consistency isn't enough. You can be consistently wrong. So we think about accuracy, and that has to be measured both between raters, internally within a rater, and the accuracy of the items and the tasks. Those are all monitored pre-test in terms of the pre-testing, but also post-test to ensure that the evidence that we're presenting to the users is actually of use and is valid. A big part of it, of course, is on ensuring that the test score is meaningful. So we think about the value of the test score. And we do that by comparing it with other estimates of ability. So for example, we might say, do we have scores from other tests that we think are appropriate? So is the test testing something very similar to IELTS? Or maybe IELTS has a similar range of scores when people take it multiple times, obviously you're going to get some variation, but if the variation is massive, you've got a problem. We also compared with existing frameworks or standards, and the most common ones, I guess, that you'll know about are the Common European Framework, the CEFR, and another one we've done recently is the China Standards of English, which was a massive project we undertook jointly across British Council, Cambridge, and the National Education and Examination Authority in China. We also look at the predictive quality of the test, and that's really important to us because, well, the test is saying this person is ready to study or to work in an environment where English is the language. Are they ready? To what extent can we be sure? Let's just think a little bit back about that, about the raters and examiners then. You can go and find out as much as you like about the rating and examining system, the recruitment system and the training system, and see what the qualifications are and what the process is. And you can see that it's quite a hefty process. The other aspect of the whole process is reliability, which is really back, if you think back a couple of slides, it's in the scoring area, and it relates to the consistency and accuracy of the scores. So we know from the published documentation that the reliability estimates for the different papers are, as you can see, and a lot of people find it difficult to conceptualize what that might mean. So what I've tried to do is to take it again in terms of the photo, the snapshot, to see how clear is that snapshot. Now, lots of people are a bit surprised when they see this, but tests, it's impossible for this to reach 1. If the test reaches 1, there's a real problem. There's a fancy term for it, it's called the attenuation process, but that we'll forget about that. Let's think about how accurate the test is. So in terms of the different papers, you can see there's a range. Obviously, listening is the best. Writing is slightly less accurate. But it's the interesting thing is when we put them all together, the overall picture of the person's ability is actually amazingly clear. So, and the published reliability for the overall IELTS at 0.96 gives us a fantastically clear picture of the person's ability, which is something I would love to see done for some other tests. In terms of predictive validity, there are various studies out there. I've just given you 3, where these are published in independent journals. There are lots of other studies that are published within the IELTS research publications. And about a year ago, or a year and a half ago, we commissioned some people to bring together all of the studies that we could find, both internal, published studies, of course, and external around IELTS, looking at the validity of the test. And we found there were over 650 studies, which makes it the most studied test out there. Let's just think now in terms of the kind of decisions that you're going to have to make at some stage about tests. Let's just think of some of the problems that we find. Some of these problems are quite straightforward. Some of them are quite difficult to deal with. The first one, no effort to define the target construct. And I don't like naming names of tests, but there are tests out there where I have no idea what the target construct is. I can see what they claim it is, but I have no idea of how you link the kind of questions in the test to the claims. It's essentially a meaningless test. Another one, very common, is no effort is made to take the test taker into account. And I call these test taker agnostic tests, where they just make a test and ignore the test taker. So the contents are either meaningless to the candidate or they're not appropriate. They don't fit. They don't take any account of motivation or interest. They're just boring. No link between the test items and tasks and the claims being made. Well, that's quite a common one. You know, some tests make these glorious claims of all of the wonderful things that a person can do. Whereas you look at the questions in the test and you think, how can they make that claim? Often, you know, people say to me, language testing is very complicated, and it can be very complicated. But in other ways, language testing is quite simple. If it looks wrong, it probably is wrong. And you just have to look at things critically. Don't take things at face value. The other big problem we have, of course, is limited or poor item or task types. So, you know, a test that has only multiple choice, for example, I always question, because there's only so much you can do with a multiple choice question. But we'll have a look at that one again in a minute. Limited or no independent research, where the only research that supports the test is research they've done themselves. And me being Irish, we have a very good saying, and that is, ask my brother, am I a liar? So essentially, am I going to tell the truth about my own test? Of course I'm not. I'm going to try to glorify it. You could accuse me of doing the same today, I guess, but anyway, I surrender. The other big problem we have is measurement focus, whereas validity is always presented as a set of numbers. When anybody does that, that's an alarm bell. It means that there's probably something wrong with the construct. If they don't talk about the construct, it means there's probably either no effort to define the construct, or there's no link between the construct and the claims being made. The last one then is exaggerated and unsupported claims. And that usually links back to correlations. And correlations are the bane of my life, and I'll explain in a minute. Here are some tests that are out there that purport to test the same thing as IELTS tests. One, it's a good test, but it relies very much on multiple choice. It doesn't have a range of item types or task types, so it doesn't give you the richness of the picture that an IELTS will give you. Some rely on their reading comprehension, for example, on a closed test. Now, we know from our own experience, and we know from very good research from University of Lancaster in the UK, that closed tests are a good test of something, but God knows what it is, because it doesn't test their reading. Because we know from eye tracking studies, where the actual eye movement of the person is monitored as they're doing the test, that they don't read the text. They just look at the box, read the little bit around it, and give an answer. And in this one, it's a multiple choice answer as well. So it's got two problems built into one. A C test, another test that's out there, claims that this is a C test. It's not actually a C test. A C test will have a minimum of 200 items and a much longer text. This is like a baby C test, and we have no idea what that's testing either. It definitely doesn't test reading ability. Students often see it as a game. It's not actually testing their ability in an appropriate way. Now I'm going to show you a correlation. I told you, everybody should have a daily rant. I'm a great believer in daily rants, and I like to have one about correlation on a fairly regular basis. Clears the system. Here's a correlation of two variables. Correlation is about 0.96. Now, if you see two tests and you think, wow, look at that correlation. These tests are exactly the same. Evidence, that's all the evidence I need. Then you'll be surprised when you see that it's actually the consumption of mozzarella cheese compared with civil engineering doctorates. So basically, the message here is that even if an exam board puts out wonderful correlation coefficients and tells you how highly correlated their test is to other tests, without some sort of a construct comparisons, the correlations are meaningless and they're misleading. So when you see an exam board claiming that their test is as good as IELTS or as good as TOEFL or as good as anybody else, and they base it on correlation, be wary, very wary. Okay, a couple of things that we'll talk about before I finish. One is, up to now, we've always been told that tests are a balance between validity and reliability. Well, that's kind of old thinking. And it's actually an easy way out, because it gave people an opportunity to try to convince you that their test is appropriate with a very limited amount of information. What we see now is a completely different picture. Validity, it's the key, it's what it's all about. And if you look in there carefully, you'll find that reliability is actually here. It's one of the many elements that goes into claiming, to demonstrating the validity of the test. So when you look at a test and you think, is this an appropriate test? You have to look right across the picture to see, is it telling me what I need to know about this test? If it's a number, that's not enough. That's one stone. Of course, if there's no number, that stone is missing and that whole building will fall down. In fact, take any stone out and your validity is crashed to the ground. So that's a real strong takeaway from today. So a couple of conclusions. What is good enough? Is it 95%? Is it a 90% accuracy? We know that these are accepted as good. 20%, that's not looking so great. 30%, that's even worse. But those are actually seen in the literature as acceptable. Now, IELTS is better than the good. And some of the other tests that are out there currently on the market, maybe some of you even use them, would be down in that blue box or below, unfortunately. Your final takeaway then. And this image has been blurred by 4%. That is 96% accurate. The reason why IELTS is strong, the reason why it's out there is transparency, basically. The numbers are published. The underlying theory is published. There are books written about the development of IELTS. The validation research is massive, as I said earlier, 650 publications plus and growing every year. Many of the alternatives that are out there, the other tests, okay, most tests nowadays will publish numbers. If they don't, then there's a real problem. But not many have published the underlying theory. Some have, but very few. And not many have published validation research. In fact, in many cases, there's none. So on that happy note, I think I can leave you. Thank you.
I think that's back to me and then to Ashley. Thank you, Barry. Great timing, by the way. I'll just highlight very briefly where we are in terms of you, our customers. The IELTS strategy generally is to, obviously, we're interested in having more and more organizations use IELTS scores. So that is a key aim for us. But also, we would like to be in touch with you, in contact with you, to support you more. We would like to be in touch with more and more people across the board at higher education institutions, recruitment, admissions, compliance, faculty, English language centres. So anyone who you feel that should be in contact with our teams, we want to hear from you, basically, so that we can aim to support you more, and also, of course, listen to you and listen to your feedback, and hear what things you would like from IELTS going forward. So they're really the key pillars of our relationship management strategy. On that, Ashley, shall I pass back to you, and you can detail how that relates to this region?
Yeah, thank you, Stephen, and thank you so much, Professor O'Sullivan, for your speech. And we are following the same strategy in our region that Stephen explained just now. We are expanding our collaboration with institutions, and we will continue supporting you with assessment needs and increase our collaboration. Our aim in all countries in which we are operating is to ensure that we provide full and prompt support for our stakeholders through our country and regional teams. So we believe that collaboration is key while providing service to our customers, the IELTS test takers. We have an experienced team of business development leaders in the region, and let me introduce them to you. I'm trying to share my screen. And I hope you are able to see now the contact information of our exams team across the region. Please feel free to approach our exams lead. So I'm the regional exams director. We have Bora in Turkey, Janar representing Central Asia cluster, both Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. We also have a business development lead based in Uzbekistan, Amir Said. For Ukraine, you can directly reach to Irina. For South Caucasus cluster, including Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Armenia, Nargiz is the responsible exams business development lead. In Armenia, we also have a business development manager, Inessa, based in Armenia. Last but not least, Nebosha is responsible from Western Balkans cluster, consisting of Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Serbia. If there are participants in this call from other countries, you can directly reach out to me, and I will be very happy to talk to you. As I mentioned, you can approach to these exams leads or directly to myself. If you have any questions or inquiries, I will also be very happy to be in touch with you, even just to talk about our sector and business. Okay, thank you once again. So all of us will be very happy to listen to your thoughts or answer any questions that you may have. So let's start it now and begin our Q&A session, which will be moderated by Ashley and Sue. So over to you, Ashley and Sue, and I'm stopping sharing my screen.
Thank you, Ashley. So we've had some wonderful questions, actually. Some of them you'll be aware we have already responded to via the live Q&A box. And some of them I would like to pose to the experts on the panel. So unfortunately, this was an anonymous question, so I'm not quite sure who sent it, but it's a very pertinent question. And I'd like to direct this to Stephen Carey. So Stephen, an interesting question has come in, which is, when will candidates be able to take IELTS safely and securely, completely remotely, from their own home without having to visit a venue physically? So quite a big question there. I'd like to offer that to you to probably give us some more detail and guidance. Thank you.
Thanks, Ash, and for the question. I think the first thing to say, there's a lot of things we could say on this, but the first thing to say is the clue's in the question. Securely. And of course, you know, whilst we know that there are a number of home-based assessments out on the market at the moment, including IELTS Indicator, which is a product that's been produced by the IELTS partners specifically for this COVID-19 period. Whilst we know there's a number of home-based assessments out there, we have, as a test provider relied on by so many different organizations, including immigration services, for really very high stakes things, we have to be sure of the security that is implicit in the test. And at this moment, this may change, of course, over time, but at this moment we see that the most secure form of testing is in a test center. That's not to say that things obviously won't change over time, but at this time the multi-layered security operations that IELTS has in place in the test centres. There's so many of them, so many different layers that we haven't been able to speak about yet on this webinar. So many of these would need to be built into the home-based test. One example is the biometrics and the finger scanning procedures that we employ for students in our test centres that track students all the way around the test centres during the listening, reading, writing and speaking tests. That's just one example, but there are many different layers of security that mean that we believe at this point that in-centre testing is favourable in terms of security. That said, you can of course build some security into the home-based assessments. Some providers are doing that. We don't yet think that the what's called remote proctoring systems for these tests are yet perfect. Some are better than others. We don't believe that they're yet perfect, and so we think that there's more time yet to come on this topic. That said, we understand that obviously with coronavirus and COVID-19, the world is changing. It's not clear yet to what extent the world has changed, but the world is changing. So we're conscious of that, and we are listening to you and to your feedback in terms of our product development and how we'll develop things in the future. I think Barry may want to add a few more points, probably on other parts of the test, not just the security. So over to you, Barry.
Well, just on the security side of remote proctoring, I know that we are doing some research into it at the moment, the same as a lot of other people. But there's quite a lot of concern now that we've seen in social media and in some of the research that's been done by ourselves and other test developers that show that quite a few of the current systems that are out there can be compromised, some of them alarmingly easily. So the process of building a system, as Stephen has just said, is very complicated. And we've already reached that decision that there isn't a system out there right now that's good enough for IELTS. That I don't think I'm telling any trade secrets there, but there's nothing out there that's good enough for IELTS. But we're working on it. And there's another question I noticed came in about validity, that this is a big part of validity. There's no point in us creating a wonderfully, beautifully valid and reliable test and then fall down on a security system that wasn't working. So I suppose there is some possibility it'll never come or it'll be quite a long time coming, but when it comes, it'll work. I think that's the big point that I would like to make. It won't come until we're convinced it's working.
I've got a question for Barry. It comes from someone who is anonymous. That person would like to know why the IELTS writing scores tend to be lower than the other ones.
To be honest, it's a fairly basic, it's a good question, but when you think about it, generally receptive skills scores tend to be higher than productive skills because, for example, we have a much higher receptive knowledge of the language, receptive vocabulary. You know, we know what more words mean than we can produce. Even in our own language, it's quite normal that we'll see a word and we'll understand what it means, but we would never have the courage or the intelligence maybe to use it. So that's the first thing. We would always expect that. The spoken language allows for far more flexibility. So there was a very good book written a number of years ago on spoken grammar, by Ron Carter and Mike McCarthy, where they actually produced a grammar of spoken language, which is far more flexible than a grammar of written language. A written language grammar has got to be more or less perfect, otherwise the errors stand out. Whereas in spoken language, we have all kinds of ways of moving bits of the sentence around. Like, he's a very good speaker, Stephen. I can say that, but I can't write it. So written language is far more difficult to produce than spoken language, or at least acceptable level of written language is more difficult to produce. It's absolutely normal. I'm sure there are many bi and multilingual people here today, and I know that in my other languages, you know, I can go back to Ireland, I can look at on Nuacht, the news on television, I can understand everything, I can read the headlines in the newspapers, I can read the headlines in the Nuacht, I can speak it well enough. I couldn't write Irish now to save my life because it's been so long since I tried. My Spanish is the same. My Japanese was even worse. So it's not unusual for us to have this jagged profile of language, and writing more or less always comes out at the bottom. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Barry. We've got another very pertinent question. Again, it was sent anonymously, and I would like to pose this question to Stephen Carey. Stephen, the question is, when, my apologies, I was about to repeat the earlier question. It's quite a lengthy one. So the question is, if my organisation decides to accept IELTS, can we work with British Council for partnerships, incentives, and other possible collaborations like professional development? So it's a very good question. Unfortunately, it's come in anonymous. It would be really helpful to know who sent this question. Just to recap, if my organisation decides to accept IELTS, can we work with British Council for partnerships, incentives, and other possible collaborations like professional development? Over to you, Stephen.
Thanks, Ash. I'll start this one off, and Asla may want to come in and add a little bit. So the short answer is yes, absolutely. We'd be delighted. Obviously, the longer answer is it depends on the detail. Examples of this type of work that we currently have with our organisations that accept IELTS scores include how we share data of different types. It can be higher education trends, it can be data on IELTS performance statistics, all types of data that we can share with our partner organisations. Other examples include how, in some cases, institutions that use or accept IELTS scores become testing centres or test venues or teaching partners for us. And another example, of course, is one, it's a good way actually of me mentioning that we would be happy to do more of these types of webinars, turning them into a series, because there's so much more that we could talk about. And where we run these types of webinars, but face-to-face in seminars in the UK, they are actually accredited as professional development there in the UK. In fact, my colleague Sue, who's here, would be able to give us more detail on that if needed. But Asla, perhaps can I pass to you, because you may have specific examples of how we work with institutions in this region.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. So we have three models of potential partnerships across the region. First one, you can accept IELTS scores for your admission processes, or you can become an IELTS registration partner. And in this scheme, we also have incentives and other benefits. And the third one is you can become our independent test center responsible from IELTS delivery. So we have 3 different models. I will be very happy if you approach me offline. I will be very happy to explain you in details. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks.
I've got another question for Barry. It's from someone called Dr. Vafa Yunusova from Baku in Azerbaijan, and that this person would like to know whether there has been any research to improve test validity as well as reliability in an English language test.
Yeah, to be honest, probably a lot more on validity than reliability. A lot of the reliability research is internal, where people there's a whole department actually in Cambridge whose job it is to ensure that the test remains consistently reliable. A lot of the work that we either commission through research grants or through commissioned research, then they're slightly different. One is competitive and the other isn't. A lot of that research is focused on some aspect of validity, and there's a whole website devoted to IELTS research reports, and if you just Google it as IELTS research reports, you'll find that there are many dozens of reports, and I just opened it now to see what comes up first. I don't know what my default is. Online series investigating preparation practices, reducing risks. So in other words, looking at the candidate experiential characteristics, improving IELTS reading test score interpretations and utilization through cognitive diagnosis model-based skill profiling. So again, helping us to understand more about what the scores mean and how to interpret them and how to report them. Now, some of these feed into the kind of daily practice that you see, and some of it feeds into the future. Where are we looking? And we have a team of people whose job it is to look down the line at where IELTS is moving, what's coming next. You know, some people are more on the technical side, but the language testing researchers are involved massively in, for example, the video remote speaking test. There are various reports published either on the IELTS research report or in a journal called Language Assessment Quarterly by people like Nakatsuhara, Inoue, Berry and Galazzi. The same names appear on various reports in different orders, but those are a whole series of the research side of the development of that process. And Stephen said earlier that there's no statistical difference between the two. Well, we were actually able to show that the only difference between the two came, I think it was 0.06 of a band, which is not only is it not significant, it's meaningless. It's nothing. They're scored in half bands anyway, and this is like 1/10 of half a band almost. So the difference between the two was negligible. Now, we were able to demonstrate that with a whole series, or actually 4 phases of research, and we published as much of that as we can possibly get out there. So a lot of that is available. And you're more than welcome to contact us to ask specific questions about specific skills, or a good starting point actually is just go to the website, the IELTS website for the IELTS research reports. There's so much there that really well worth reading.
Thank you, Barry. If I may, just if we still have time, there's another interesting question just come through from the chat box. And I'd like again for Stephen to address this one. So Stephen, the question is regarding apologies, it just disappeared now. Indeed, is there any difference between the IELTS verification service and the STED RO service? Perhaps you'd like to elaborate on what the STED RO service is first. Thank you.
Sure. I'll just try to keep this very simple and clear. So the verification service is to verify the paper test scores as we saw before, and you can get access to, you can get a password for the registration service at ielts.org/organizations, filling out a form. There is a second service that is also there where you can, at the same place, which you can sign up for, which is variously called STED-RO service or electronic download. You may see it referred to in some places. And this enables institutions to download electronically all of the scores that have been requested to be sent to your institutions. Personally, I think I would recommend using the paper and the verification service. The download service is relatively old, and occasionally there can be technical issues with it. However, if you prefer to use that, then please go ahead and sign up. Speaking to our continuous product development, the IELTS partners have rolled out a brand new IELTS results service with the kind of electronic download capability to institutions in the US and Canada, which is where we have had greatest demand for that service in the past. And it's possible that after the pandemic is over, etc., we may look at extending that new IELTS download results service to additional regions. At the moment, my recommendation would be to register for to continue using the paper scores and the verification service. Hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Stephen. So unless there are any further questions, perhaps Sue, have you got any more further questions for Barry or Stephen from our Q&A?
No, there don't seem to be any that I can see.
Okay. So I think it's a perfect timing. So we came to the end of today's webinar. We would like to thank our speakers and our guests for joining us today, and looking forward to seeing you at the future sessions. Have a great day.